I wouldn't have said so, no. Not really. But no, I don't get the feeling that she's wildly optimistic about life. But a pragmatist, I think.
Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene. She simply pushed back her chair, looked directly across the gathering at Camilla, and walked toward the door. But inside a room filled with people trained never to react, that quiet departure landed like an explosion. Camilla's first royal gathering was supposed to demonstrate unity. Instead, one empty chair suddenly exposed a division the palace had desperately hoped nobody would see. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla had called the gathering for a clear reason. She wanted senior members of the family together under an arrangement shaped by her own household priorities. A private evening meant to prove that the monarchy had accepted a new internal order. A royal household is the group of staff and advisors who support a senior royal and help organize duties, events, and private arrangements. For the queen consort, the evening was supposed to establish confidence. For Anne, it quickly became something else entirely. Anne listened as Camilla began explaining that several traditions linked to Queen Elizabeth's private family gatherings would be reorganized. The Princess Royal understood that change was inevitable. What struck her was the language. When Camilla described certain customs as belonging to a previous chapter, Anne's expression hardened. She slowly placed her napkin beside her plate and looked toward Charles. The king had spent a lifetime understanding his sister's silences. This time, he did not answer them. Camilla kept speaking. She did not retreat or soften the announcement, apparently convinced that hesitation would weaken the authority she was trying to establish. The queen consort explained the new arrangements with controlled confidence, while Anne remained still. Yet that silence carried more force than an argument. The Princess Royal was not offended by a seating plan or some minor question of etiquette. Palace insiders later described the dispute through private accounts shared within royal circles, revealing that Anne believed her late mother's legacy was being treated as something to be cleared away rather than carried forward. Then came the sentence that changed the room. Camilla said the restructuring was necessary because the family cannot remain governed by the past. Anne's chair moved almost immediately. She met Charles's eyes for a brief moment, rose, and walked away without asking permission or saying goodbye. The king stayed seated after the door closed, one hand resting against the stem of his glass. Camilla looked toward him, waiting. Charles looked instead at Anne's empty place. Nobody spoke for several seconds. That silence told its own story. Anne had endured decades of royal disagreements without abandoning a family gathering. If she chose the door this time, then the real confrontation had started long before that chair moved. To understand why Anne chose the door instead of another minute at Camilla's table, the story has to move beyond that silent room and into the deeply personal loyalties both women carried into it. Saved for all upcoming sections, faster delivery is the priority, and slight variation above or below the target word count is fine. For Camilla, the evening represented arrival. For Anne, it felt dangerously close to erasure. One woman was attempting to establish herself inside a role that had taken decades to secure. The other had spent a lifetime protecting traditions formed under a mother she had served as both daughter and working royal. That difference mattered, because beneath the titles, ceremonies, and polished smiles were two women defending completely different definitions of loyalty. Anne's connection to Queen Elizabeth II had never been limited to family affection. The Princess Royal had spent decades watching how her mother approached duty, restraint, and private family life. Royal service means carrying out official responsibilities on behalf of the monarch and the institution. To Anne, even small customs could hold enormous meaning because they carried the memory of how Elizabeth had kept the family grounded behind the public ceremony. Changing them was possible. Treating them as disposable was something else. Camilla faced pressure from the opposite direction. She knew that remaining permanently beneath Elizabeth's shadow would make genuine authority almost impossible. As queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king, rather than the sovereign herself, she needed to establish that Charles's reign had its own rhythm and household identity. The gathering therefore mattered beyond dinner. Camilla wanted recognition as the king's partner in the present, not endless comparison with the woman who had defined the monarchy before her. Anne heard that ambition differently. She could accept modernization, but language suggesting her mother's era needed to be deliberately swept aside touched something raw. Camilla saw administrative independence. Anne felt emotional displacement. At the same time, the queen consort entered the evening already expecting judgment. She knew the princess would examine every alteration closely, and beneath her controlled manner sat frustration that she still seemed required to justify every attempt to shape her own role. The tension had started weeks earlier. Anne had already challenged 2 smaller changes involving family occasions, arguing that some traditions belonged to the crown itself rather than to any individual consort. Charles knew about both disagreements, yet he avoided forcing a direct conversation. The king hoped time would soften the conflict. Instead, his silence allowed each woman to believe he privately understood her position. Anne sensed the warning even before the gathering began. Days earlier, she read Camilla's invitation alone at her desk and paused over the phrase describing the evening as a new beginning. She placed the card down and quietly told an aide that beginnings did not require pretending everything before them had vanished. That sentence revealed how deeply the dispute had already settled inside her. But even that invitation was not the true beginning. One smaller ceremony had already changed Anne's view of Camilla completely. The empty chair at Camilla's gathering was only the visible fracture. The real break had begun weeks earlier, during one seemingly modest ceremony that Anne would later regard as the point of no return. The walkout did not begin at a dinner table. It began weeks earlier, inside a smaller royal gathering almost nobody outside the family noticed. There were no shouting voices and no public scandal. Yet one change ordered that afternoon struck Anne with a force no formal argument could have achieved. A tradition connected to Queen Elizabeth was removed. Camilla defended the decision, and from that moment, Anne stopped seeing the dispute as modernization. She saw it as a warning. Anne entered the private Windsor Remembrance Gathering expecting the same quiet ritual the family had followed since Elizabeth's death. A remembrance gathering is an intimate family occasion held to honor someone who has died, without the formal weight of a state ceremony. Then she noticed the missing place setting. The symbolic space reserved in her mother's memory had been removed on Camilla's instruction because the queen consort believed continuing the gesture kept the household tied too firmly to grief. To Anne, that explanation made the absence hurt even more. Anne stopped beside the table and asked a senior aide who had authorized the change. When the answer came back, she did not argue with staff. She asked to speak with Camilla privately. The Princess Royal understood that the custom carried no constitutional importance. That was exactly why it mattered. It belonged to the family's private language of loss, not to protocol, rank, or public image. Anne spoke with controlled anger once they were alone. She told Camilla that mourning traditions disappeared when families were ready, not because someone decided they had become inconvenient. The queen consort refused to retreat. She answered that she could not run a household organized around symbols of someone who was gone. Then came the phrase Anne would remember long afterward. Camilla described the empty setting as a shrine to yesterday. Anne's expression changed. She replied that yesterday was the reason any of them were standing inside Windsor at all. The words were not dramatic, but they cut directly to the wound. For Anne, Elizabeth was not an obstacle to the new reign. She was the foundation beneath it. For Camilla, preserving every symbol risked freezing Charles's household inside another monarch's memory. Neither woman believed she was being cruel. That made the divide harder to repair. Charles heard about the exchange soon afterward. The king chose not to reopen it, believing silence would keep the argument from growing. Anne expected something different. She thought her brother might restore the gesture, or at least acknowledge why its removal had hurt. When he did neither, disappointment settled beside anger. Anne made one final choice before leaving Windsor. She quietly asked for a small item associated with her mother to be returned to the table, adjusted it herself, and stood there for several seconds before walking away. So when Camilla spoke again about leaving the past behind, Anne was no longer hearing an abstract philosophy, she was hearing Windsor all over again. And this time, she was prepared to answer face to face. Anne had already reached the corridor when Camilla followed her. What happened next transformed a dramatic exit into a family confrontation neither woman could disguise. There were no cameras, and almost no witnesses. Just two senior royal women standing a few feet apart, one demanding the right to shape the present, and the other refusing to let the past be treated as an inconvenience. Then Anne finally said the sentence she had been holding back for weeks. Camilla refused to let the departure become the final word. Moments after Anne left the table, the queen consort excused herself and followed her toward a private corridor away from the reception rooms. A reception room is a formal space used for gatherings, conversations, and official hosting inside a royal residence. Camilla told Anne that walking out in front of the family had undermined the entire purpose of the evening. If cooperation was going to survive, she said, they could not answer disagreement by abandoning the room. Anne turned back with anger that had been building since Windsor. The Princess Royal said she had never objected to Camilla creating her own role or helping Charles shape a new reign. What she could not accept was hearing her mother's lifetime described as something the household needed to escape. Anne's voice remained controlled, but the restraint made the words sharper. She was not defending every old custom, she was defending the meaning attached to them. Camilla's frustration finally surfaced. She answered that every decision she made was being interpreted as an attack on Elizabeth. The queen consort asked how she could ever establish herself if every change had to pass some invisible test set by a memory. Anne listened, then stepped closer. She did not shout, "Build whatever future you want, but don't speak about her that way in front of me." Camilla's expression stiffened. For the first time that night, neither woman attempted to hide the hostility between them. Anne then returned to the wound Camilla had hoped was finished. She reminded her of the removed remembrance setting at Windsor, and accused her of dismantling symbols before the family had emotionally released them. Camilla rejected the accusation, insisting she was trying to prevent grief from becoming permanent policy. The disagreement had now moved beyond tradition. It was about who had the right to decide when mourning should end. Charles arrived at the worst possible moment after an aide alerted him. The king looked from his wife to his sister and asked both women to return to the room. Anne refused. She told her brother that neutrality was no longer neutral if one side was being allowed to redefine their mother's legacy without resistance. Charles said nothing immediately, and that silence was answer enough for the moment. Anne had finally said what the family had avoided saying aloud, but her words created an even more dangerous question. When loyalty to a wife collided with loyalty to a sister and a mother, where would Charles actually stand? Charles had spent years defending Camilla's place beside him, yet Anne was not an outsider challenging his marriage. She was his sister, one of the monarchy's hardest-working figures, and the person invoking the memory of the mother whose crown he now wore. Suddenly, the king faced a decision more dangerous than choosing between two angry women. He had to decide whether his reign would demand separation from Elizabeth or remain visibly anchored to everything she represented. Charles understood the limits of his authority better than anyone. As monarch, he could set the direction of his household and approve how private royal arrangements were handled. The royal household means the network of staff, advisors, and routines surrounding the sovereign's official and personal life. But the king could not order Anne to stop grieving, nor could he force the family to accept change on command. That was the problem. Formal power could settle a rule. It could not settle memory. Camilla carried a different kind of influence. She shared Charles's daily private life, understood the pressure surrounding his reign, and had gradually shaped the social tone around him. Her power was personal rather than constitutional. meaning it came from trust and proximity rather than legal authority. After returning from the corridor, she asked Charles privately whether Anne would now be allowed to challenge every change she introduced. The king hesitated. Camilla noticed. His silence hurt more than a direct disagreement because it suggested he was no longer certain she had gone too far. Charles felt trapped between two loyalties that could not be neatly separated. If he defended Anne too strongly, Camilla would feel publicly diminished inside the very role he had spent years helping her secure. If he defended his wife without qualification, he risked appearing to approve the deliberate stripping away of his mother's presence from family life. The king had wanted the evening to demonstrate unity. Instead, it had forced him to confront how fragile that unity actually was. Charles made his choice quietly later that night. He instructed staff that no further personal remembrance traditions connected to Elizabeth were to be removed until the family discussed them together. The order was not a dramatic reversal, but its meaning was unmistakable. He had frozen the very process Camilla had defended. Charles did not tell her immediately. After midnight, the king remained at the dining table after everyone else had gone, Anne's chair still slightly pulled back. He moved it into place himself, stood behind it for a moment, then repeated the instruction to an aide. No more changes without his approval. By morning, Camilla learned what he had done. The decision landed hard. Anne had walked away, yet somehow her absence had changed policy. Anne's walkout had lasted only seconds, but by morning, it had altered palace decisions, unsettled Charles's household, and left Camilla confronting an uncomfortable truth. The empty chair had carried more influence than her entire gathering. By breakfast, nobody needed to mention Anne's name. Camilla could see the consequences everywhere. Staff who had previously moved quickly on her instructions were suddenly waiting for confirmation. Planned changes were being reviewed. Charles was unusually quiet. The gathering meant to mark her growing confidence had produced the opposite effect. And when Camilla discovered that her husband had personally paused the disputed changes after Anne left, the humiliation became painfully private. Camilla entered the morning briefing, expecting routine control, and found hesitation instead. Household staff had been told that changes involving established family traditions were now to be referred upward before implementation. In simple terms, decisions that once moved directly through the Queen Consort's team now required extra approval. The shift was subtle, but she felt it immediately. Every sentence sounded more careful. Every recommendation seemed wrapped in caution. Camilla had wanted authority to feel settled. Instead, it suddenly felt conditional. Anne, meanwhile, did nothing to deepen the spectacle. The Princess Royal returned to her duties and made no public complaint, issued no statement, and encouraged no faction around herself. That restraint made her influence harder to dismiss. Edward and Sophie separately raised concerns that traditions linked to Elizabeth were being changed too quickly. Neither presented the issue as loyalty to Anne. Both framed it as discomfort they had already felt. The argument was no longer one woman against another. It was becoming a family question. Camilla confronted Charles privately. She asked why he had frozen the changes without discussing it with her first. The king answered that the family needed time. She heard something else in those words. Time seemed to appear whenever she tried to establish something distinct from the previous reign. Charles tried to explain that slowing the process was not a rejection of her position, but Camilla's frustration had already hardened. She had spent years waiting to belong. Now, after finally reaching the center, she felt herself being told to wait again. Camilla returned to the briefing after Charles left, but the agenda no longer held the same meaning. She reached the line describing a new family framework, meaning a revised approach to how private traditions and responsibilities would be organized, and stopped reading. Then she closed the folder without finishing it and asked the room to be cleared. For several minutes, she remained alone with the uncomfortable truth that Anne's silence had achieved what confrontation might not have. Charles understood the danger by then. Formal meetings were only making each side more defensive. If the damage was going to be repaired, he would have to speak to Anne without staff, agendas, or Camilla between them. The palace could suspend decisions, but it could not suspend the emotions beneath them, and Charles now understood that repairing the damage required one conversation he had avoided from the beginning. There was no private secretary in the room, no household aide taking notes, no Camilla, no agenda, and no ceremonial language to hide behind. Just Charles and Anne, brother and sister, speaking about their mother. For the first time since the walkout, the dispute stopped being about royal authority. Anne explained why she had left. Charles stopped defending procedure long enough to listen, and what he heard changed the direction of the conflict. Charles had chosen a modest sitting room rather than one of the formal palace offices because he wanted the conversation stripped of rank. A private secretary is a senior aide who manages a royal's official business and correspondence, and this time, the king wanted none of that machinery between them. Anne understood the gesture immediately. She told her brother she was not trying to control Camilla, deny her position, or preserve every habit exactly as Elizabeth had left it. The Princess Royal knew change was necessary. What she could not accept was the idea that change required deliberate distance from their mother. Anne finally let the grief beneath her anger surface. She told Charles that hearing Elizabeth's traditions described as obstacles had felt like being told the family needed to erase parts of her in order to prove loyalty to him. The king did not interrupt. For once, he listened without defending the household or explaining intentions. Anne admitted that the walkout had not been planned. She had left because staying another minute would have turned controlled anger into words she might never have been able to repair. Charles answered with a confession of his own. Living beneath constant comparison with his mother, he said, had been exhausting. Every change seemed to invite a question about whether Elizabeth would have done the same. Yet the monarch also acknowledged something harder. His need to establish a distinct reign had made him less sensitive to how aggressive some changes felt to relatives still grieving. Anne reached across the small table and placed her hand over her brother's. I wasn't walking away from you. I was walking away before I said something I couldn't take back. Charles understood the difference. The king agreed that modernization and erasure were not the same thing. From then on, personal family traditions linked to Elizabeth would be discussed collectively rather than treated as symbols that had to disappear for the new reign to feel secure. Anne gave something in return. She agreed that Camilla needed room to build her own identity, and promised not to treat every departure from Elizabeth's habits as an insult. She also agreed to meet the Queen Consort again. Charles and Anne had found language for the wound behind closed doors, but outside those doors the story was only beginning to explode, and the public would see the empty chair very differently. By the time the story escaped palace walls, Anne's walkout was no longer a private disagreement. It had become a symbol. Newspapers dissected the timing. Broadcasters debated whether loyalty to Elizabeth was colliding with Camilla's authority. Crowds outside royal residences discussed a dinner they had never witnessed, as if they had been seated at the table themselves. Then one front page reduced the entire crisis to a single unforgettable image: an empty chair. The leak changed the scale of everything. Details of Anne's departure, the argument over Elizabeth's family traditions, and the tension surrounding Camilla's proposed changes reached the press within days. A royal communications team is the group responsible for managing official statements and media responses on behalf of the household. Their language remained careful, stressing continued cooperation and refusing to describe the disagreement as a feud. But that restraint only increased public curiosity. The less the palace said, the more people wanted to know what had happened. Camilla quickly became the focus of the debate. Critics argued that the changes had been pushed too aggressively and that traditions tied to Elizabeth deserved greater sensitivity. Her defenders answered that no queen consort could be expected to preserve every private custom from the previous reign forever. Camilla understood the argument had become larger than her intentions. She had wanted room to establish a new household. Now every adjustment was being judged as evidence of whether she respected the woman who came before. Drew an equally powerful reaction. Many admired the Princess Royal for defending her mother's memory, while others questioned whether leaving the gathering had made reconciliation harder. Yet Anne refused to exploit the attention. She gave no interview attacking Camilla and issued no public accusation. Her silence mattered because it denied the story the open warfare many expected. Then came the front page that defined the moment. One fictional morning newspaper ran a stark image of a formal dining chair beneath the headline, "The Chair That Said Everything." The article described Anne's departure as the clearest symbol yet of resistance to rapid change inside the royal household. Near Windsor Castle, visitors discussed the dispute beneath walls deeply associated with Elizabeth's final years. Some left flowers nearby, turning an argument about legacy into something painfully human. Days later, the temperature shifted. Anne and Camilla appeared together at a scheduled royal engagement. Their interaction remained restrained, but it was unmistakably civil. Neither woman pretended nothing had happened. More importantly, neither allowed the disagreement to become permanent estrangement. The world had reduced the crisis to an empty chair, but inside the family, its meaning had become something far more lasting, a lesson about how a new reign could move forward without treating memory as something that had to be defeated. In the end, Anne's walkout was not a rebellion against Charles, nor was it an attempt to humiliate Camilla forever. It was a boundary drawn at the exact moment grief, authority, and ambition collided. Camilla needed permission to become more than Elizabeth's successor in family life. Anne needed reassurance that becoming new did not require declaring the old irrelevant. And Charles finally understood that his reign would be strongest, not when it escaped his mother's shadow, but when it stopped fearing it. Charles turned that understanding into a practical settlement. Private traditions directly tied to Queen Elizabeth would not be removed merely to prove the independence of the new reign. Family consultation would come first, and change would happen gradually. In simple terms, consultation meant that relatives affected by those traditions would be heard before decisions were made. The king had finally stopped treating memory and modernization as opposing forces. He could protect one without sacrificing the other. Camilla kept her authority. The queen consort continued shaping her own gatherings, household priorities, and personal role beside Charles. But she abandoned the language of replacing a previous chapter. She no longer needed to prove strength by creating distance from Elizabeth. Anne, in turn, accepted that every altered custom was not automatically an insult. The Princess Royal recognized that the family could move forward without repeating everything exactly as it had been before. Anne returned to a later private family dinner without drama. Camilla greeted her personally. She accepted the greeting, took her place, and remained through the entire evening. Their reconciliation was not sentimental. They did not suddenly become intimate confidants. What changed was respect. Camilla acknowledged that Elizabeth's memory could not be managed like an outdated policy, while Anne accepted the queen consort's right to build something new. Camilla made one gesture before the dinner began that said more than another argument could have. A small family object associated with Elizabeth remained in its traditional place. Anne noticed it immediately. She did not praise the decision or reopen the old dispute. She simply looked toward Camilla, gave a slight nod, and sat down. The message was clear. The boundary had been understood. Charles had finally chosen a principle rather than a side. His mother's legacy would be honored. His wife's role would be respected. Neither would be strengthened by diminishing the other. The walkout had forced the family to confront what polite silence had allowed to deepen. For one night, Anne's empty chair looked like fracture. In the end, it became the moment unresolved grief was finally acknowledged. Anne left Camilla's first gathering because remaining silent would have felt like surrendering something sacred. When she eventually returned, it was not because she had forgotten the insult, but because the family had finally learned the lesson behind her departure. A monarchy survives change, not by erasing its past, but by carrying it forward with enough respect to make the future worth accepting. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.